All right, welcome to our week 3 lecture, where we're going to really get into the arrival of England to the North American colonies. And if you hear that noise in the background, that's both my dogs are back there being jerks, and apparently there's no stopping it. So hopefully you can hear over that noise. All right, so first we need to talk about some religious movements that were taking place in Europe at this time. There were several different ones, but the main religion in most of Europe was Catholicism. And so there were some different groups that started branching off. We have Lutheranism, which took hold in Germany, started by Martin Luther. There were the Huguenots in France, started by John Calvin. They unsuccessfully tried to colonize parts of South Carolina and Florida at one point. Unsuccessful because they were killed off by Spanish nearby. And then, of course, we have the Church of England that was started in England by Henry VIII in 1534. And this is Henry VIII here. It's well, not really a handsome-looking fellow, but if you watch the show The Tudors, he's quite handsome. He, of course, switched over the religion of England because he wanted to get a divorce from his first wife. And so the entire religion of England switched over from Catholicism and then became the Church of England. Okay, let's move along here to the Elizabethan period, and this is shortly following the reign of Henry VIII. During this period, when Elizabeth was queen, England was relatively stable. So she adopted more moderate policies, like across the board, including in the religious arena. She ended a lot of religious strife that had been taking place, especially while her sister Mary was in charge. And during this time, there was a population boom. So between like 1500 to 1650, the population of England went to 3 million to 5 million. That's quite a large jump. And because of that, England became Spain's biggest rival in the colonies. And, Spain, got to the Americas first, so they were there. And then England started wanting to dabble in that as well. England needed to expand, so there weren't enough jobs for the population size that they now had. And another thing that started happening were the nobles who had all of this land, and they had peasants and serfs living off their land. They started fencing off some common areas where people could grow their own crops, tend to their sheep or whatever, started fencing that off. And so people became more impoverished, but while the wealthier became more wealthy. So a lot of people were looking to leave England at this point. Mercantilism. So this is a good term to know, and this is a really long definition of mercantilism. What you want to know is that basically mercantilism is when a country enriches trade in its favor. So they set different policies with regards to trade to try and balance it more in their favor. So these are things like tariffs, trying to secure more money, keep more money in the country. And so forming colonies, that plays into mercantilism, because if a nation had a colony, that would give them direct access to whatever raw materials that colony had. They would be able to produce more of their own goods and get fewer imports, and that does add to the wealth of a nation. So let's start talking about English colonization. So the very first colonial charter from England went to this guy named Gilbert in 1578. And you don't hear about that one because they drowned at sea. So it's not really that important, except that it's the very first English charter that is granted. So 1578 is the first. One of the, starting to be successful type missions was Walter Raleigh, who was given a charter to go to Roanoke. You may have heard of Roanoke. It's known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. I think they also did an American Horror Story season based off of Roanoke. But Raleigh, thought that it would be a, really successful venture, that he'd heard about this black legend, like everyone had, where Spain was taking a lot of heat for the way they were treating the native population. And so Raleigh often cited De las Casas and other propaganda works, saying that England should go over there and save the native people from Spanish tyranny, convert them into Protestants, save them from Catholicism, and if they did all of that, the native population would be super grateful to England. So he was very optimistic leading into this. So when they got ashore, Raleigh and his men, their ship ran aground when they were trying to land, and seawater got in and ruined all of their food. So off to a bad start. So they get there, they get on shore. The native population at Roanoke did not have enough food to share, which is not surprising. You're not really expecting this ship full of people to come crashing ashore. And so one thing that the English are good at in this time period, which is unfortunate, is convincing each other that the native population would attack them. And so the English start attacking first because they're worried that they're going to be attacked, or they are saying they're worried they're going to be attacked. And so one example is nearby one of the native people thought that maybe they had stolen a cup from the English camp there. And so in retaliation for a possible stolen cup, they torched the entire village. At another point, they agreed to a meeting, like a diplomatic talk, and instead of having this talk, they slaughtered all of the native people there, including the chief. So really, claiming to go and save these people from Spanish cruelty, yet inflicting their own cruelty on these people. So while they were there, things were not going well. Didn't have food. They were killing off the native population, not making friends. Francis Drake arrived in 1586, so a couple years later, after he had torched St. Augustine, which was Spanish holding. And so when he arrived with his ships, settlers poured onto Francis Drake's ships because they did not want to be in Roanoke anymore. Unfortunately, Drake had a cargo full of enslaved people from the Caribbean and native population that he had taken as well as enslaved people. And in order to make room for these English folks, he stranded hundreds of these enslaved people in Roanoke with nowhere to go and no food, and brought a bunch of the English people back home. Walter Raleigh did not want to give up, so he sent more people back to Roanoke in 1587. And so there was another refreshment of people living there. But then it was largely forgotten. So Spain was at war with England, and so England kind of just ignored Roanoke. And 3 years later, when people finally went back to go check on the colony, everybody was gone. So many of them dead, some of them thought to be adopted by the native population. But this is why it's called the Lost Colony, because everyone just disappeared. But because of his, exploring ways, Walter Raleigh was knighted, and he called this land that he had arrived to Virginia. And on the slide here it says, because sexism. And the reason it's called Virginia is because it's named after Elizabeth, who was an unmarried queen, and therefore, obviously, she was a virgin. So that's, kings were allowed to have several mistresses and sleep with whoever they wanted, but a queen was expected to be a virgin until she got married. The funny thing about that is it's pretty obvious looking through historical records that Walter Raleigh himself was one of the queen's lovers, and he named this land after her virginity. So that's a little funny, a little gossipy tidbit there. All right, moving along. So Jamestown. This was approved by James I in 1607. So Virginia. Elizabeth is gone at this point. James I is the next monarch. And so he allowed for this expedition, and it was given to this company, which was named the Virginia Company. So this charters were sometimes given to a company who had financial backers, and then the company would run the colony. So they got there, they set up their fort. It was a really nice fort. You can kind of see the representation of it here in the background, a nice triangle fort. But they set it up in a swamp, which was a really bad idea. So a lot of people got disease from different different insects and mosquitoes and whatnot that were in that swamp. Another problem with Jamestown was that a bunch of the people who came over were not laborers. So there were a bunch of gentlemen who didn't want to do any work. And you'll read, if you haven't read already, in that Jamestown article that they had this policy of collectivism. And so everybody in Jamestown got the same amount of resources and food, no matter what sort of work they were doing to help out in the colony. And so all these lazy rich dudes would sit around and do nothing and still get food, and this small handful of people who were growing food or building the fort and what have you were getting the same amount. So people stopped working, there wasn't enough food. And so they did have several periods where they were starving. Most notably was the starving time of 1609. And so going into this winter, they started with about 500 people, and at the end of the winter, there were only 60 people left. So people murdered each other, people died from just starving, some people tried to eat their shoes. One man famously ate his wife, and John Smith, in his journal, made a comment saying, like, he's heard of a lot of different foods, but never in his life has he heard of barbecued wife. Just a little thing that makes me chuckle whenever I see it. Okay, let's see. So because they were out of food, especially during that winter, when the local native population would not willingly give over food to help them out, they would go in and steal it. So there was a lot of problems with that group. It was called the Powhatan Confederacy. And that's what we're going to talk about here. Let's see, we have the Powhatan Confederacy. The chief's name was Powhatan. And in 1607, Powhatan decided to incorporate Jamestown into his confederacy, which was a really generous thing that he did not have to do. He was just bringing them into his fold, welcoming the English people into his group. And when he did this, he, sorry, I'm getting distracted, my dogs. When he did this, he had the ceremony. And John Smith was kind of the leader of Jamestown at this time. And John Smith was at the native village, and Powhatan started doing the ceremony, which was misinterpreted. The ceremony had some people like pretending to kill John Smith, so it was this mock death, and then Pocahontas ceremoniously sort of saved him. They were never going to kill John Smith. This was a way to signal the death of these people as Englishmen and their rebirth into the Powhatan Confederacy. But it did go down in history often as Pocahontas saving John Smith, and then, as you know from the Disney film, probably a romance between the two, which never was the case. In 1608, Powhatan was asked to submit to James I by the English people, and he was kind of confused. Why on earth would he ever submit to this English king? His people are over here starving. They're depending on this other nation for food. Powhatan Confederacy outnumbered the English. And so he refused. The relationship wasn't super great, but while Powhatan was in charge, it was better than it would be later on. So in 1609, John Smith ended up leaving, and the relationship got even worse because John Smith had tried to stop some of the stealing of supplies, whereas the people in charge after John Smith didn't really care. They really started stealing a lot of, especially corn, and torching the villages and such. And so Powhatan refused to feed them anymore. And then that does coincide with that starving time of 1609. So fast forward a few years, in 1613, those English folks took Pocahontas hostage. And she ended up being married off to John Rolfe, not John Smith. John Rolfe, who is the man who starts the tobacco craze in Virginia. Thank you, John Rolfe. And so the whole time Powhatan was in charge, he had plenty of opportunities to sort of attack these English people, especially during the starving winter, 1609, when there were only 60 left, but he chose to let them stay. And I'm noticing the time here, so we're going to have to pause, and we'll finish this slide when we come back for part 2.